Oh, we got 4 attendees now, but they're all right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. My Hand and McCruder are glad to be hosting this, and we appreciate Reonda, Washington helping us out. Just a few things before we get started. The webinar has been approved for 1.25 McBAP credits. Thanks goes out to Midstate Health Network for helping us out with that. We're hoping to get the certificates emailed out in the next 2 to 3 weeks. We plan to post the webinar and slides to our website within 2 to 3 weeks as well. There will be some polls during the webinar, and we really want you guys to participate fully in doing those polls, so look for those. Questions are encouraged, and Reonda will address them as they come up, and we're hoping there might be a little bit of time at the end for questions as well. You can use the question box or probably the chat box. But I'm just going to read her bio and we will get started. Reonda Washington is a substance abuse prevention specialist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her work involves helping students to make healthy choices around alcohol, researching the UW-Madison alcohol culture, collaborating with campus partners to build capacity, implementing alcohol prevention programs and data analysis. Reonda has been a member of the UHS Healthy Campus staff since July of 2013. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Health Education and Promotion from East Carolina University, a Master of Public and Health Promotion, Education and Behavior from the University of South Carolina, Columbia, and is a certified health education specialist. She has a background of conducting outreach and education to various populations in different settings. One of Reonda's proudest achievements is her Color of Drinking study, which looks at how the UW-Madison high-risk drinking culture impacts all students, but specifically students of color. The initial findings show how the alcohol climate impacts campus climate with sense of belonging, safety, retention, flourishing, and racial microaggressions. Some of the research and outreach work that she is currently doing is examining the role drinking plays in connectedness, belonging, and flourishing on her campus, how alcohol impacts communities of color, and international students working with Greek life alcohol, risk reduction, research why students go to detox, and collaborating with housing and UWPD on a program for high-risk students. Again, welcome, Reonda. Thanks for helping us out. And we'll turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Mike, for the introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. Like Mike said, I am Reonda Washington, and I am a substance abuse prevention specialist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I know webinars are very different to go through. At UW-Madison, my position is located in our University Health Services. And our health center is an integrated health center, meaning that we also have medical, mental health, and then prevention, which is the unit I am in. We're all together in the same place. And so my office is what would typically look like a health promotion office, but we focus more on policy systems and environments. So we don't do that much programming, but we do lots of other things, or I also run Alcohol EDU, which is part of what sparked how this study came about. So as I mentioned, I'm Reonda, and I do use she, her, hers pronouns for anyone who's asking me a question later. I want to go ahead and get started with some of the things in the program. Okay, so there are some learning objectives that were sent with the program, and I'm not going to read all of these for you, but we will be acknowledging a lot of these things, and they look differently because I like to talk about mixed methods and how I know you might not have a data person where you are, or you might not be the data person. So there are other types of data and different sources that you can look at and that we used for the study or that spark things in the study. We're going to talk a little bit about how our campus reacted to these results as well, and how we came to define alcohol as a social justice issue, and how alcohol and race climate impact each other. So you will hear me reference some pieces from the book, and I've actually pulled some out since we're in a webinar and you won't have the actual booklets, but if you want to look at the actual booklets later, here is the link to look at that later. So to start off, I actually wanted to give a definition of social justice because I find that knowing sort of what we're talking about, I like this definition from Bell in 2007 because it talks about social justice as a process and a goal, and it talks about having equitable resources to help make things physically and psychologically safe and secure. And then what I also like about this definition is it talks about social justice requires action instead of being very passive. So it is very active. Sort of a roadmap of where we're going. So you have an idea of some of the things we are going to talk about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about UW-Madison, the place I work, the university, and sort of what makes our students special. And then some information about UW's alcohol culture. And because we are in modern times, alcohol and COVID, they have showed up a lot on our campus in ways sort of expected, but in other ways sort of not. And then a little bit of about our racial climate on our campus and a small bit of theory. I'm not going to go into a lot of theory, but then also taking a break and having some things to think about and consider. Then I'll talk a little bit of how we got to color drinking, and then I will go through all of the findings and do a quick debrief about the survey. And then finally, sort of campus responses to color drinking and what we have learned and what we are continually doing, even though, as I'm sure many of you are experiencing, COVID has become the big thing that everyone is focused on and having to work with. So I'm going to stop my video and just present so you can see everything. Well, this is data pulled from last year because this year's data isn't all the way fleshed out with us starting and stopping and starting and stopping in the deadline for students to withdraw moving. So we don't have our full demographics yet. But normally our campus is a large public institution, D1, and it's research. We are located on a Native American burial ground from Ho-Chunk Nation, is what the school has been built on. We are a predominantly white institution, as you can see by our demographics, and some of you are probably wondering, where are your indigenous students? They make up 0.9% of our population, normally around 115 total for graduate and undergraduates. When we start looking more at some of the specifics of our population, as we see, we have about 3,100 who are undergraduates. And last year was an odd year. We had like a whoopsie with administration. So 50.3% of students were in state versus 49.7 were out of state. One of the interesting things about our students is we have a wealthy student body compared to a lot of other places. The average family income for all students is $154,900 of their families, and then only 53% of our students apply for FAFSA. Of that 53%, 123,000 is the average median income, and 88% of those students are in the fourth percentile when they're measuring wealth for FAFSA. So we have a big gap among wealth among our students and their families, because I know not all students' families pay for their tuition, but we don't really have a middle class. So that adds to interesting dynamics of what you see and who can afford to do certain things or has access to certain resources. And then majority of our first year students do live on campus. And again, that is a little bit different this year because of COVID. Yes. So before I move on, sorry, poll. We had a poll. So I'm getting ready to hop into some of the alcohol, but like with the population that you serve, what is a song that would describe your alcohol use on your in your environments or populations that you work with?
All right. I
And
love
you can think pre-current and current. All right. A lot of you have the same thing I would have picked for my population, which is Bottoms Up by Trey Songz. And second, All right. So talking a little bit about our alcohol culture, and I'm going to go big within the state of Wisconsin and shift down to what this looks like and means for our campus. So for Wisconsin, we are the number 2, sometimes number 1, depending on the year, state in binge drinking for 18 to 44 years.
Reonda, I think we may have lost you. Are you still there?
Year-olds. And I highlight the 18 to 44 because it's not just, did you lose me?
Yes, we lost you for a second there. If you want to rewind what you just said for the last 15 seconds or so.
Okay, sorry. So our drinking culture, 18 to 44, it's mostly the 18 to 44, but within, or it's the sort of ingrained within the state. And sort of like what you saw when the COVID in May started getting lifted, there were lots of people, and we
Unfortunately, I think we lost you again, Reonda. Hopefully, we'll get this figured out.
made national news because people were going to the bar. Can you hear me?
We lost you again. I lost you again for 30 seconds again. Try one more time. Maybe I don't know if everybody else did it, but I certainly lost you for a second.
Okay. I will try one more again, and if not, maybe need to reboot and come back. Sorry, y'all. All right, y'all are losing me. All right, let me try one more time. If not, I'll go back and restart. Because again, so again, for our binge drinking rate, 18 to 44, and then with the COVID context, when the ban was lifted, you sort
Yeah, it looks like we lost you again, Reonda.
saw that culture of people just going to the bars. Oh,
You keep cutting in and out. So if we want, we could try rebooting, if people are comfortable with that. Or we could try just you rebooting quickly.
okay, I'm gonna reboot quickly if that's okay with everybody.
That's fine. Thank
Okay.
you. Sorry.
It's like, sorry, y'all. All right.
We appreciate everyone bearing with us for the technical difficulties. And hopefully Reonda will be back. Yeah. If anyone is worrying about continuing ed credits, don't worry about that. We'll give you everyone full credit.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Okay, that's good.
I will make sure. Can you share your screen? Are you able?
Yes,
Perfect.
I believe so.
Yep.
Sorry, all technical difficulties and all. Okay, can we hear me now? Sorry, everybody. So I'll start this one again. Wisconsin is number 2 binge drinking state for 18 to 44-year-olds, and it sort of is ingrained within our culture within Wisconsin. And so most people, we do apply the legal limit, but there's some different laws in Wisconsin. And from when COVID and like the mandatory staying at home, staying sheltering in place let up, everyone went to the bars like right after. And so it showed like just what people valued in our state. So then also looking at some of the other bigger pieces in our state, alcohol is really cheap in the state of Wisconsin. So we have some of the lowest alcohol taxes. For example, our beer tax has been 0.04 cents since 1969. And all spirits and wines are also pretty cheap in our state, cheaper than other states. We also have weird state laws that protect businesses and taverns rather than, people's health and well-being. So there is no state board of alcohol for the state of Wisconsin. All things alcohol are run by municipality. So all municipalities get to make whatever rules and follow within people. And so the Tavern League, which is a big lobbyist group, runs a lot of the rules or things within the state of Wisconsin. And again, helping to support the business. So some of the laws that are different in our state that might be different in yours in Michigan is like a DUI, we call it an OWI, is a misdemeanor here. It is not a felony like in other states. So someone can get 5 before their license becomes suspended. We also have an interesting rule when it pertains to our students with the parent law. So a lot of states have you can drink with your parent in the privacy of your own home. Well, Wisconsin takes it a step further, and at any age, it's supposed to stop at 18, but no one really enforces this. You can drink with your parent, grandparent, guardian, or step parent at the tavern, and you can order as long as you're with them, and they don't have to say it's okay, so you can drink in public. And so that is something different within our state when we think about laws. And for example, football, which is coming back for us, also plays a role in what this looks like. So then when we start looking about the state alcohol outlet density, so this is a map of the state of Wisconsin or of all the states, and the red dots and the big one are bars, and the yellow dots are grocery stores. As you can sort of see in Wisconsin, we have a high concentration of bars, and then this picture next to it is just like the concentration of taverns in the state of Wisconsin. And so you see we have really high concentration of bars just everywhere, and some of the like dots in the middle are lakes because we have a lot of lakes in Wisconsin. So then when we start looking at our campus environment, so our high risk drinking rate among our undergraduate students is 50.3% of our undergraduate students drink at high risk, compared to the national average from the same survey of this year at 36%. And some of you are probably like, well, what about them other Wisconsin schools? Believe it or not, they are at 35%. And so we have a high number of students who are drinking at high risk once they are in our campus environment. We know from Alcohol EDU that we attract students who drink more than other states before they step foot in on our campus. And we know on average, most of our students start drinking around the ages of 16 and 17, with a few drinking 14, 15, and then the lowest amount, but there are still like 2% that start drinking at 11. So we keep that in mind. When we think about our campus, and our campus is an isthmus, that means we're surrounded by lakes on two sides, and you're seeing like a piece of our campus which is on the lake. But there are 376 establishments that students can go purchase alcohol that are around or in the radius around campus, and again, including some lakes. And our campus does sell alcohol in our unions. 70% of all union sales are coming from alcohol. So then the other sort of thing that we notice within our population of students who get transported to detox, which the state, Dane County, which is the county that University of Wisconsin-Madison is located in, has a detoxification facility, and it does have a harder substance wing, and then there is the alcohol wing for people who, not just students, throughout Dane County who are found to be too intoxicated or incapacitated are sent and kept until they blow zeros. But our police department does breathalyzers on all alcohol cases. And so of those who were transported, the average BAC was 0.222. And for those of you that are wondering, 0.08 is the legal drinking limit to drink and drive, and 0.222 is almost 3 times that. So our students tend to, when they're drinking, have higher rates of drinking and tolerance in some cases than other places. So here's just a little bit of data showing that it's not just our first year students. What we're seeing on our campus is our students tend to drink more high risk the longer they are at UW-Madison, with you see that drop off that 5th year. But what we're seeing is that they develop whatever drinking patterns first year, and then they carry those drinking patterns and get into a rhythm the longer they're in our environment. A lot of our high BACs, with the exception of a couple, are normally students who are of age and needing to be transported, meaning 21. So then just a little bit about alcohol and COVID. I'm sure like all environments, COVID has become a big concern, and alcohol is a vector for which people are becoming exposed. So in our UW-Madison bubble, we started seeing things in June amongst our Greek students specifically, who are our highest risk drinkers, and we had about 300 cases break out. The CDC visited Wisconsin around this time because there was a spike in 20 to 22-year-olds or 20 to 24-year-olds, and they're trying to figure out why. But what we found from that was that there were bars in Madison that bartenders who had COVID were serving people, and the bars weren't socially distanced, and that infected a lot of our students at the time. So we tried to fix, like the university tried to put some things in place specifically for Greek life, and like thinking about what do we need to have in place for when fall was coming. So then fall came for us on September 1st, was when classes started back. Move-in was on September, or started August 25th, and was 4 days for students to come back, but we also had the older students already back because they could move in on the 16th. And so within that first week of classes starting, we had a surge of 1,000 cases. By move-in, there were 9 Greek chapters that were put in quarantine. And then the next week, there were 22 chapters. And then our highest risk residence halls, Celery and Whitty, were put into quarantine, which was 2,000 students. So all the high-risk drinking spots, or where we noticed high-risk drinking, that impacted COVID among our students. And some of the things they went to go get before gaining COVID, because there's videos, and that's what's in that lower left-hand corner, are alcohol, and they were just more open with their alcohol. Now we have outdone the quarantine and we started back in school this week, but they also announced that football is coming back for us. And of course, you've been seeing in the news substance use disorders linked to COVID susceptibility. So we're waiting to see if our cases tick back up. We've gotten our campus ones to go down, but Dane County has increased cases. And so we're waiting to see what's getting ready to happen, because football goes back into effect on October 24th. And then normally the 31st, which is also a Saturday, is a big holiday around here, Freak Fest, drinking holiday. And so no one said that's canceled or not, but then that was just going to compound our infection rate. I think. Yes, I have my next poll. So I'm getting ready to shift to talking about racial climate, but like, what changes have you seen in your community due to increased racial climate? And again, you may pick more than one.
Please take a quick second and vote in the poll. We got about 60% of you have voted.
Okay, lots of protests. We have had those, as well as internal work starting to be done and programming. All things that are happening, but yes, protest has been a big one in our environment, and that's added to some not great racial and environmental things, which I'm getting ready to show you about our campus and pictures and tell you about a couple of things that have been going on that this current climate has just been accelerated by. So on our campus, when I'm talking about climate, I'm specifically talking about racial climate. We, like a lot of other campuses, started seeing like the rise of Black Lives Matter and students starting to protest in 2014 with Trayvon Martin. And then we kept seeing like sort of the student activism grow. But then for our campus community in 2015, there was a young man that was shot in the community. He was biracial by a white police officer. And so then that enunciated some racial tension that was going on. And so students and community started, wanting more things to change with the university and within the community, and started protesting, started going to the legislatures, really tried to make a change. So then we got to 2016, which 2016 for our university was like one of those turn point years. And I know that was only 4 years ago, but it was still the after effects of what happened that year are still playing into current situations we have going on. So in spring of 2016, we had 55 pretty high profile hate and bias incidents that were going on our campus. Students getting spit on, swastikas, nooses. Like we had lots of things, death threats, KKK Bucky. Bucky is our mascot. So we had like tensions were rising, and it was also an election year. And like sort of one of the big things, which I have like one of the pictures of, the white supremacy is a disease. There was a African-American student who was tagging things. He got arrested in the middle of his African-American studies course for this, and the charges were eventually dropped, but that just added more fire. And so we started seeing some things against students and police, because police got into Twitter fights with students over racist incidents, which is his own set of things. So then we get out of that semester, which spring, that was hard, but then we get into fall, which was right before the election. And someone wore an Obama mask to one of our home football games. And their friend had a Trump mask and a Hillary mask and like had a noose. So then this caused more chaos for our students. Through all of this, our university hasn't been really good about dealing with racial tensions among our students. There was protesting, there were stops of homing parades, there was threats of funding being pulled. Like things started getting pretty dire because of 2016. Then we start moving on past 2016, and we've had students with a clothing line where white people are racist get attacked by legislators, and the legislators threatening to pull our money. We have had students who were protesting climate change last fall, the starting of last fall, get nooses around trees and stand on ice blocks. We then had last fall another incident that became another big tipping point for our campus community, which was the homecoming video. The homecoming committee had worked with different student groups of different racial ethnic backgrounds to record a video that was supposed to release for homecoming. They released the video and there were no students of color, but the video talked about diversity. So that became a bigger charging point for our fall as well. And so there became more retaliation with the UW's for White sign, as you're seeing, and some of the other protests started happening again around campus. And like students were, you know, saying that they wanted, you know, certain demands and things in place. And then we had another big incident where the Multicultural Learning Center floor was attacked with students, white students writing stuff, like harassing the residents, and their RA tried to intervene and the RA was magically losing their job. So yes, and so then now we are in current state with George Floyd, then Breonna Taylor, and we had lots of protests because Madison is in the capital city. So guns and bullets, rubber bullets were shot at student protesters in May or June. And then Kenosha happened. For those of you that don't know, Kenosha is only 2 hours from us. And again, as I have mentioned before, Madison is the capital. So with all of the protesting for us this summer, our State Street, which connects the university to the Capitol, all of the businesses on State Street have been vandalized, and even our campus bookstore and our campus library have been vandalized by protesters. Tensions are really high, especially because of the other pieces of the Jacob Blake case, like with Kyle Rittenhouse coming up and shooting people in the community. So we've had a lot of like tendencies on top of COVID and everything else going on. But then we also have had two women, one uses they them pronouns, who were UW alumni, and one is a current UW-Madison student, who are white but were portraying themselves as people of color and had written theses and acclaim. And so for our students of color, that has been like the biggest insult. And as one is still a student currently, that is causing all kinds of tensions that, again, we haven't been dealing with well on our campus, but again, it's in a bubbling cauldron. And like for COVID as well, we've had like our international students and our students from Latinx countries have become bigger targets. As you can see in one of the pictures I've put from State Street, they've been targeted more and been blamed, but then messages have been put for them in places. So again, our campus racial climate is really high tension. I know everyone else's might look at some different variation, but ours has become a big kettle for things. Then when we merge that with alcohol, here are some things that showed up, and these have been over times, and some of these have been student things. So another thing I like to sometimes use as an insight to what's going on with our students is social media. It tells you a lot of things. That's how like Badger Barstool in the video is about students buying their alcohol before quarantine and a lot of other behaviors. And I sometimes have student workers who analyze some things. So from 2016, the Real UW campaign happened, or students started writing with the hashtag the Real UW about things they had experienced on campus. And I got one of my students at the time to analyze what the content of these things were. And what they found was 1 out of every 20 things that someone reported to the Real UW, alcohol was involved as the aggressor. And what you see with some of the things that have been happening around our campus, like the young lady who was spit on in her residence hall, the person was drunk and spit on them and said racist things. We've had people draw swastikas that were drunk. The disruption of a healing circle on Native American land, and at the Native American residence hall, people were yelling out the window drunk, mocking the elder as he was trying to provide support to the survivors, because Native American young ladies have the highest rates of victimization on our campus at 47%. We have also had like our own fraternities and sororities, which saying things to people, and that'll be showing up in some of the color of drinking stuff. But like saying racist slurs and making people feel uncomfortable. The things on the side I've picked up from our biopic by POC at WISCO, where students tell stories of what has happened to them on campus. And some of them talk about alcohol stuff or people doing things to them when they're drunk. And so on our campus, there is this culture of drunk people causing more harm than normal with already simmering racist tensions, but doing things while drunk. And depending on the situation, sometimes they get held accountable, sometimes they do not. And for students of color, this is adding to some of their strife of how they experience being a UW-Madison student. So moving on to sort of talking about a little bit of theory and all of this, I always like to give a little bit, and I'm not going to go deep, but I like to use the multi-contextual model for diverse learning environments. And what you sort of see here is talking about what you need to have a diverse learning environment for all students. And you sort of see it looks like the social ecological model. But like there are like 5 big components that run throughout it: the historical, the organizational, the compositional, the psychological, and the behavioral, as well as the processes and having things. So the physical presence is, you know, when you recruit people to come, like having housing, having course, being enrolled in the university. But once the physical presence is met, the other things that are very crucial factors are the social psychological presence, which is mattering. Do you matter? And relational presence, which is belonging. And those sort of influence those big pieces for students to feel like they have a place in a diverse environment. Do students of any identity feel like they matter and belong? And if not, who matters, who belongs, and how does that impact how, in some cases, social justice or resources are allocated throughout your communities? So I'm going to take a little bit of a break, but like some things to think about, because I know I've just thrown a lot of things into you before I hop into the data about our color of drinking study. But like, how are you feeling? How are y'all doing out there? Because I know that was a lot, and with the technical difficulties, do apologize. All right, you know, thinking about what are the dynamics with the population that you work on when it comes to alcohol culture in itself. You know, how is COVID and alcohol showing up in your community? What are the dynamics of racial climate wherever you are? Because again, we are in an election season, and there have been some pretty significant things that have happened outside of everywhere. And then thinking about what data your campus community has. And this big question that will be playing throughout that I want you to think about is, how do we cultivate and maintain an environment that is inclusive and responsive to all the needs of all of our students? Okay. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, there are increases in yeah, we know the peninsula. Like in Wisconsin currently, just like with COVID, the numbers we're spiking again. And even though the university for right now is low, everywhere within the state, we've gotten some notices that we're like there's 11 or there's 7 of the top 10 cities that have COVID in our camp. Yes, no one wears masks in the rural places, yes. So I do have another poll before I move to the survey results. And so this is just about access, about substance use in your own populations.
I'll give people just a few more seconds to answer the poll.
So data from major surveys collected every couple of years for the majority of people. And some people have limited, some people don't have it. And like another property, like we get data sources frequently. On our campus, we get data really, really frequently. That's come why my job has shifted more to data. But so for the color of drinking survey, here's a link to the booklet again before I hop into everything. But for the color of drinking survey, this all actually started because of alcohol EDU. So my first year at the university was 2013, and I run alcohol EDU. I still run alcohol EDU 7 years later. But I was able to pull out our data and look at all of our data by populations. And so no one had ever had the data about, how students are doing. And so we pulled it out by different populations, and I went on a data tour all over campus because people were like, oh, this is fascinating. Because seeing how fast our students and at what rates our students come in, which coming in high, but when you looked at students of color versus white students, you saw there were significant differences. Like students of color were more likely to be non-drinkers at double the rate or more than their white counterparts, and high-risk drinkers at below half. And so you can see like that was really interesting to populations. So how this all started was I took this information to ASM, which is our student government, and because we are funded by SEGFI, also happened to be my board of directors. And I shared this information. And the chair at the time, her name is Mila, and she was an African-American young lady. She came and asked me, well, Ms. Washington, do you have any data about the impacts high-risk drinking has on students of color, specifically discrimination among students? And I was like, no, I don't, because if you think with all the research, negative consequences for alcohol are only asked about the drinker's consequences, not negative consequences to everybody else. So it's like, okay, I'll look into it. And at the time I thought, oh, I just need to add a question to a survey. That's all I need to do. So I had our student workers over the summer sort of start doing lit reviews of, can you find me information about discrimination happening because of drinking or drinking for students of color? The research basically said students of color don't drink at high rates, and it normally stops there. You have to look really, really and few things to find like, well, what about this other piece? So hired myself a student, Melissa, and we decided to do focus groups because we're like, what are we really trying to ask? We don't know what we're trying to ask, still thinking, oh, we're just adding a survey question. We started with the Machistas, which was the Latinx subgroup. They gave us the feedback they ain't got time for, focus groups because they're busy students. They're like, we'll do a survey. My response was skeptical, and I certainly said this out loud. Are y'all going to check your email? They're like, we will if it's a 10-minute survey. So that's how we did color drinking survey 1. And that was only to undergraduate students of color. We tried to go through IRB. IRB said it wasn't research at the time. But we started seeing some of the things we were seeing. And so then we're like, we got to do this a second time, but we want this certified as research. So we did do it IRB Institutional Review Board. Sorry. We did want it to go through the Institutional Review Board so we could publish and make the things public. So we did it a second time. And how we did it was instead of just doing only students of color, we did a sample of white students because the good thing about Color of Drinking 1 is it elevated students of color's voices and the sea of whiteness on our campus. And so it made it really substantial for them. But we wanted to do it again and make sure our findings were the same across the board of what we found the first time. And so we did a sample. All of the students got rewarded with a $5 Amazon gift card. Apparently students really like if we get an Amazon gift card guaranteed versus chance-free drawing. They were good with it at the time. So we got about a 25% response rate with students of color, and we got about a 17% response rate with our white undergraduate students. So the first question that we always ask in Color of Drinking is, how would you describe the UW-Madison alcohol culture? I like qualitative data personally, and like didn't put any restraints on what students could say. So there were themes that emerged, and one of the themes is the same between both groups, which is a very prescient point of the alcohol culture is how UW-Madison students socialize. But for students of color, it's also prevalent and pressure to participate is high. And then for white students, the alcohol culture encourages drinking heavily, and participation in the culture is dependent on who you socialize with. So this is like an excerpt from one of the pages to sort of show you what students are talking about, how it's encouraged and how they don't feel safe, but also really hitting home that both groups said the alcohol culture is how UW-Madison students socialize, which we'll see throughout themes throughout going forward. So then I have set up the other pieces of the presentation as takeaways that you can take away from everything instead of just what's going on. So takeaway 1, alcohol use by the majority is a protective factor for academic and social success. And I'm going to show you exactly what this means. So in color of drinking, we did see that students of color were less likely to be high-risk drinkers compared to our sample of white students, which we saw from Alcohol EDU, we see it in our ACHA, we see it in our Healthy Minds data. We basically see it everywhere on campus, also in campus data like who's more likely to go to detox, in our sanctions data, who's more likely to have an alcohol sanction. It's mostly majority students, white students. With those. But in color of drinking, I did add the diner flourishing scale. And we see this also in Healthy Minds, and we did it in Alcohol EDU. So the results are basically the same. What we found is that for white students, there is a correlation between flourishing and alcohol use. But for students of color, there is no correlation really between alcohol use and flourishing. And for those of you that don't know what flourishing is positive mental well-being. It doesn't necessarily mean mental health disease versus versus having mental health disease. It does on our campus map onto each other. So answering some of the questions that I see. Most retailers can, they just have to have a license, but it's really easy to get a license, short of basically murder. Once you get a license, you can have it forever. Does living off campus make a difference? It sometimes does, but students still have access to it, as we're seeing with some of the answers that I was talking about fraternity and sorority life early on. But getting back to flourishing, positive well-being, and like it has nothing to do with being a college student, has nothing to do with alcohol use. But the students who had the top flourishing scores, 48 is flourishing period, but the students who scored 52 to 56 are the top flourishers and have the highest rates of flourishing. For white students, they tended to have better outcomes of flourishing because of alcohol use. Oh, so then the other thing that we noticed, which is a weird thing, is that students who report using alcohol reported having, still high at GPAs. We weren't seeing that there's really a difference between grade spread of students who drink versus students who don't. And why this is weird is because the research says the more you drink, the worse your grades are. In our campus, we're seeing that alcohol really isn't impacting students' grades. And y'all are like, well, this is reported. What do you mean? So I have some actual stuff in the next slide, because we do this every year at our campus. So adjudicated students are students who had alcohol violations. Their average GPA was 3.8. With our Greek women, who are the highest risk female drinkers, they drink at a rate of 77% high risk. They consistently have a higher campus GPA every year, and that's one of the things they use as a selling point to recruit new people to the PHA, Panhellenic Association. And then Woody and Celery, which are our highest risk residence halls and their towers, they always have significantly higher GPAs, and they're always in like the top 3 with high GPAs compared to the other 20 residence halls, even some with learning communities. So we're seeing that our students are able to, those that drink, do well in our environment. So then the second takeaway, and can I have the poll question? Oh, it's the wrong one, but it's okay. we'll do it for this one and I'll go back to the other one. Safety is a concern among all students, but students of color are more disproportionately impacted. Okay, yes, alcohol is tied to belonging in your environments. That is correct. That's sort of what we're seeing. So, in alcohol and color drinking, both times we asked our students, do you avoid specific places due to your concerns about alcohol? And students of color have gone up to about 50% saying yes or unsure, versus white students about 40%. And like, because I know students of color are not a monograph, when we broke it down by some of the groups and identities that we had, we saw that like Black students had the highest rates of avoiding places, as well as multiracial students on our campus. But what was interesting is the places that both groups said were basically the same thing. Fraternity and sorority housing, which majority of is on Langdon Street, State Street and the bars, and house parties. Okay, so we're seeing all of those things in our environment, and they're the same for each group of students. So one of the things I always like showing, because not everyone is familiar with our campus, is this small map of our campus. And so Langdon Street is where our Memorial Union is, and Greek housing is like right up here, all the way up here. And then this is State Street, which connects campus to the Capitol. There are lots of bars, like there's a bar right there. And then like once you get further down State Street, there are more bars. And so what I always talk about is like Memorial Library is the only 24/7 library on our campus. And it is located right between the two. So regardless of what identity you hold, if someone is studying at the library, doing stuff at the union, they might come across someone who's heavily intoxicated Thursday, Friday, and Saturday nights, and that can make them not feel as safe. Some of how students talk about their safety from Color of Drinking 1, there's nowhere I feel less safe, and being yelled by drunk people. So the next sort of newer question that we asked for Color of Drinking 2 that we didn't ask in 1 was, has alcohol use impacted your overall health and well-being in the time you've attended UW-Madison? And students responded back and forth about this. And what was interesting more so is what they talked about. So for students of color, they talked more primarily about mental health and their safety, versus white students talked more about physical health and their social life comparatively. We had a lot of gained weight, but for students of color being like, I'm too scared to leave my house on game day because of the harms or things that people may say to me. As you can see with some of what they were talking about, things got progressively worse. But people really have anxiety and are scared or concerned for their safety when you see it for students of color about where they're going in our environment. So what we know is that students of color have higher rates of depression compared to their white peers. We know they have higher rates of anxiety compared to them. And also suicidal ideation becomes really interesting. Students of color, while they don't have this high of rates compared to our transgender and gender nonconforming students, they are more likely to see suicidal ideation as an okay thought to have, or it's okay to be having thoughts of suicidal ideation, especially in our environment. We also look at our female undergraduate victims. Majority of women of color, with the exception of Asian women, have higher rates of victimization compared to their white counterparts. And then when we look specifically at alcohol facilitated sexual assault, we see that we're a little bit higher than the average. And going back to that alcohol is how you socialize thing, and this is not victim blaming, it's looking at what is our dynamics in our environment doing for students, is majority of victims are ingesting voluntarily the night of perpetration. And so part of that is because of that environment of, well, if you want to socialize and have friends, you need to drink. So moving on to takeaway 3, and tying this one is the belonging piece. Alcohol use, specifically high-risk drinking, is tied to how UW-Madison students connect and belong. We did ask a belonging question this time because we kept seeing this theme pop up among our students. And we asked them, has your personal alcohol use or the alcohol use of others impacted your overall sense of belonging at UW-Madison? And regardless of race, about 50% of them said, yeah, alcohol is tied to belonging. And so here are some of their top themes. If you don't drink, you don't fit in. One of my favorite quotes from Color of Drinking 1 is turn up or transfer, drink or leave. Alcohol use by others makes me feel isolated. Alcohol use amplifies racial issues. And then with white students, there are little nuances, and I'll show you with what their responses were. Alcohol helps you fit in. If you don't drink, you don't belong. Alcohol helps you meet new people. Drinking alcohol helps me feel like I belong at UW-Madison, and alcohol use helps you bond. And so what we're seeing here is that alcohol is heavily tied to social belonging in our campus. But the other things that people don't sometimes realize is our campus mascot is a badger. And a lot of our students of color and some of our white students don't identify as a badger. They're like, don't call me that. Because a badger is seen as someone who drinks a lot and is doing things, even though that is our mascot. And so a lot of students are like, and especially students of color, I would rather be referred to as a UW-Madison student. It becomes really interesting when we do messaging because we don't say all badgers, we say UW-Madison student, because that is the feedback we have gotten, because they don't feel like they belong and because they feel like that caricature of what it means to be a badger is tied to alcohol. So then one of the cool things that we've been able to do with data, because like I said, we've been digging more into the belonging piece of things, and this is from our Healthy Minds data, is the vertical axis is I have a group or community or social circle at UW-Madison where I feel I belong, feel at home, known and connected to and supported in my identity. And then the horizontal or the x-axis is I see myself as part of the community. And what we did was we took all of the drinking questions and saw where students answered based on their drinker type for a lot of things. And what you're seeing, the group that has the high sense of belonging are the ones that alcohol is impairing their daily life. They've binged in 2 weeks, or they've used any alcohol. They have a moderate audit C, or they have a high audit C. But the students who have lower sense of belonging is the students where alcohol hasn't impacted their daily life. They don't binge, they have a low audit C, or they don't use alcohol. So we know it is very highly correlated, at least at UW-Madison. The other thing of when we put marginalized identities on top of that, again, who has high sense of belonging and who has low sense of belonging, are the non-dominant identities. When we ask the exact same questions, minus the alcohol piece. And so this plays on top of each other of sense of belonging on our campus. For those of you that are trying to figure out what all the dot colors mean, the green ones are race and ethnicity, the yellow ones are sexual orientation, the red ones are gender identity, the pink ones are financial stress, the orange ones are disability, and the purple ones are international or domestic status. And the blue ones are first generation status. So other data that support some of this belonging is our campus climate survey with our students, acknowledging that they don't feel like they belong. And also students of color in general have lower rates of feeling safe, welcomed, and respected than their white counterparts, but more rates of feeling excluded. So then now talking about fourth takeaway, racial climate and microaggressions impact student of color's well-being and retention the most. We did ask about microaggressions, and we only asked students of color about experiencing microaggressions because we're using this definition, and by this definition, it can only be experienced by students of color. So what we saw from color of drinking 1 to color of drinking 2, things really didn't change that much. About 62% of students said, yes, I have experienced a microaggression at UW-Madison. And our Irony of Ironies were the first campus survey to actually ask specifically about microaggressions. Started in 2015, and I think there's only been 2 other surveys on our campus that have asked specifically about microaggressions. But then when we look at how this is being experienced by different groups, we see that Black and African students have the highest rates, and then Latinx and Middle Eastern students have the next ones. But then we do some of the statistical analysis, which we're also writing a paper on. If you start with race and go to gender, Black women have the highest rates of experiencing microaggressions. If you start with gender, then go to race, it actually ends up being Asian women who have the highest rates, depending on how you break down the analysis. So from our current one, and you can see some of the quotes from students, things that they talked about were harassment based on race and ethnicity or assumed race or ethnicity, classroom interactions, which to me, when people asked what was the most surprising thing from this was the most surprising was the classroom interactions and how students describe them, then the alcohol-related microaggressions and stereotypes about race or ethnicity. When we did color of drinking 1, we found that 48% of students talked about microaggressions related to race and ethnicity, or to alcohol, sorry. And so here are just a couple of things that they said. And this one always the first one of this one always has been one of the ones that sticks out to me because it's the most degrading the student has ever felt on university property. And I don't know if we were able to retain this student. And then here are some of the other things that they were talking about. So then we did ask both sets of students, have you witnessed a microaggression and have you intervened? Students of color, of course, witnessed more, but there were still a surprising number of white students who said they had witnessed, but what we noticed was intervention was low among both student groups. And again, looking at what our campus climate survey sort of showed, again, they didn't ask specifically about microaggressions, but have you experienced, witnessed hostile, harassing, or intimidating behavior? Then in color of drinking, we asked, have you considered leaving the university? And students of color were 4.5 times more likely to have thought about leaving the university compared to their white peers. And we asked them why. And what I always point here, and I only put the top 6, if you look at the booklet, there are like 10. But the top 6, alcohol is here. But what I look at for students of color is they cite racial climate first among anything else, and then mental health. And then for our white students, it's academic reasons and mental health. And alcohol also plays a higher role for white students in considering leaving than our students of color. And then our campus climate survey also asked, but they asked, have you seriously considered leaving? And the top reasons for students of color are basically about the same. So the 5th and final takeaway is allowances and exceptions are made academically to support drinkers and the alcohol culture. So from color of drinking 1, we asked how have you experienced academics, and some of the things that students brought up we added to 2 and to look. So having to find alternative study spaces because of the alcohol culture. When assigned group work or group meetings, having to schedule around consumption of alcohol, specifically the alcohol holidays, Thursday, Friday, Saturday nights. And professors and TAs like making jokes and making you feel uncomfortable in the classroom. That one's statistically significant. But these are all exceptions that are being made for the drinkers, basically. And so from color of drinking 1, here's some of what students talked about. And this top one is the one that has gotten me to do more work with faculty and staff, because students talked about, like, it's made me feel uncomfortable in the classroom when professors or TAs consistently talk about drinking or have students meet up to drink. So then we also asked about, because of your own drinking, the normal, like how has this impacted your academics? And we see like students of color have lower rates of experiencing this, but they're also less likely to drink compared to their white counterparts. But being too hungover to attend class, choosing to drink instead of study, and performing poorly on an assignment were the ones that were statistically significant when we looked at all of this. And again, a little bit of from Colors Drinking One, what students sort of said in response to all of this. Okay. So I know I just threw a lot at you. And some things I want you to think about, or you can pop in the chat. What are your initial thoughts? You know, some of those bigger things of what can we do to address things in our campus and supporting things in the community. What do you think you could take back as a piece? And then I'll hop into how we responded and all the things that we have done and are still trying to do amongst our current space. Okay, I'm going to move on and talk a little bit. Oh, there's somebody. Oh. Huge takeaway is that we see exceptions and allowances are made for drinkers. Yes. All right. So on our campus, some of the initial things, and like this is the initial campus response. Our university police department, not with what's going on currently, but we're the first ones to actually be like, we're going to do something because Reonda, this is the second time you have told us that students don't feel safe on Langdon Street. So for those of you that don't understand, because we are an urban campus integrated into the city, Langdon Street stops for us at Lake Street becomes MPD's jurisdiction. And so our police department can't write tickets on Langdon Street. We get called to help all the times, but so what PD decided to do was, you know what, Reonda, like they were the first group which is like, nah, you don't have to sell. Students don't feel safe. This is what we can do. So they had more of a presence on Langdon Street that following the First 45 Days initiative, which is a big alcohol initiative on our campus. And so where we have increased enforcement, like we all coordinate. And so they had more of a presence and they worked with the city to mitigate that, which has now gotten us the Langdon Street liaison officer, which is Diego. And he has the ability to write for the 6 blocks on Langdon Street and around in the bars to help with mitigating issues. The Red Gym hosted the Red Gym After Hours, an alcohol-free event open to all students. And some of you are like, well, what does that mean, alcohol-free events for everybody? And aren't you doing that? On our campus, because of how things are, like our unions, for example, serve alcohol. So if you host an event there, there's no alcohol. It's not considered an alcohol-free event. And housing does host alcohol-free events, but it's only open to residents of housing. And so this was the first time that the Red Gym, which is home to a lot of our minoritized groups, so it's home to the Multicultural Center, the LGBT Campus Center, it's home to our International Student Services Center. It's home to a lot of the big centers that help support students. And they had 2 events to help people connect and belong and help them meet people. We did have like the Dean of Students outside because it was on Thursday and Friday nights. And they did catch some students trying to attend drunk and did not let them in so that this space could be held. But it helped to build community and it's something that we are trying to continue, but given the state of this fall, we haven't been able to. University housing changed a lot of its policies and I feel like they keep having to change their policies. And then Center for Leadership and Involvement, which is where Fraternity and Sorority Life used to be under. They've now moved to having their own office. They simply made the ask of our Fraternity and Sorority Life members not to load their buses for events in front of the Red Gym. Again, Red Gym is home to lots of groups, but the Fraternity and Sorority Life students were loading the buses to go to their events in front of it. So as we know with most students, they would be pre-gaming and be pretty intoxicated. And if they went into the gym, they would cause and be harassing student groups. And so Center for Leadership and Involvement is like, you know what? We're going to ask y'all, and they just moved it without really telling them why, because students are like, oh, that's why that happened. They moved it down the street in front of the lake, where there's not really a building, but like that's where students load their bus to help with some of the harassment issues. So some of our more strategic responses. So we have just become a student affairs division. And at UW-Madison, this is our second year being a full division. And so it's one of the Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs like strategic priorities is color of drinking, and some of the things that it addresses, like helping students belong and connect and finding ways to help our non-drinkers or students in recovery. The Inclusion and Identity Division is using color of drinking to help with programming and strategic planning. Our Office of Inclusion Education, which I have now joined on a part-time appointment, is doing a lot of the programming, and we're incorporating things within inclusion education from color of drinking to help students see their power and privilege within the campus. Fraternity and sorority life got audited and had a big review. And so color of drinking is one of the guiding pieces that is part of that. And it shows up in our Langdon Street Coalition as one of those priorities of you need to address racism, and you need to think about the environmental impacts your alcohol use or alcohol use within your community is having on the community. And there are strategic goals and things that are associated with all of that. And then our Student Involvement Coalition has used color of drinking in response to, as I mentioned, the homecoming video in the past and in their list of demands. The still at the bottom is a screenshot taken from their response to the homecoming video, and it's taken on Langdon Street. This home isn't safe after sunset, and they mentioned that that was specifically a call out to color of drinking, as well as some of the rates that women hold, but they're not feeling safe there, and that was one of the things that they asked the administration and list of demands pre-COVID. To start addressing how do we make all students feel safe, how do we have better foods, and all of those things. And then our students have used it in weird and interesting ways. So besides just what I mentioned about the student involvement community, in 2016, student activists used color of drinking data at the end of like that spring of hell to actually advocate to get the Our Wisconsin program. The Our Wisconsin program is a facilitated dialogue discussion, and it's now required for all students. It's gone online right now for COVID, and I'm pulling the data for that live sometimes. But like students in 2016 used the color of drinking because it showed we are having multiple disproportionate impacts, and y'all know we are hurting. Y'all need to give us something to help build, capacity among students to help each other out. Then our Multicultural Student Center used color of drinking to help advocate for the APITA and the Latinx cultural centers, which we have now, and they're finished building them out since we are now not there. And then our fall color of drinking was incorporated into our Badger Step Up program, which is a bystander intervention program for all of our students. Why do I think social norms are so different at our school? Partially, I think, because I have worked at another university in the Midwest, I partially think it's because of some of the laws and things that we have no control over as a university. Yes, we can hold students accountable when we catch them, but the fact that there are so many places you can buy alcohol, that the rules are lax, that students, like I often ask students that do drink, like, how fast could you get alcohol if you really wanted it, regardless of what age they are, and they're like 30 minutes. Some of our students have fake IDs. It's just a lot of access. And so like if you think about the 5 A's of environmental management, we honestly have control over one. And so I think that does a lot of why the norms look so different on our campus and why alcohol is such a big portion and how it is ingrained in our culture versus like The police, I use them as an example because I've done ride-alongs with them. And like the biggest thing for them is like the sense of entitlement that our students have towards drinking is sometimes hard for them to even undertake. Like if they catch someone who is under 21, obviously intoxicated, they will stop, cite, give them a ticket if they don't need to be transported. But the students will say things like, it's my right to drink, be gone, peon. And like, you know, I'll just take the ticket and do things. So that adds to just like the acceptableness and the norms that they have either brought with them or that are helped perpetuate in our environment. So then sort of looking at those broader impacts of color of drinking, it has done a lot for our campus, and people don't always think about these things. And like now that I'm, this is the 5th year since the first one has been done, and the 2nd to 3rd year, depending on when you think we did it, that we have done it, is it actually got the attention of our campus administrators, because it was one of those things that they couldn't argue with. Like, yes, we have all of this data because we are a Research One institution. And what we find is that that finally got alcohol on their radar to take it seriously, because that's part of the other reason the norming was bad, to take it seriously, but also to start thinking about, as we call it, the secondhand impacts of alcohol use, one being racism. And thinking about how do you do this. It brought alcohol into the campus climate conversation, because like many campuses, I'm sure, or even in the community, campus climate, racial climate has been creeping into some of the work that you're doing. And besides just the broader things of what is causing people harm or what groups are more susceptible, it's the how are other impacts really impacting people. And like at first, like our administrators, this helped them talk about alcohol and campus climate. But we've also gotten some traction with faculty and staff. In my division, we do have someone whose job it is to work specifically with faculty and staff, and we're working on reevaluating practices in the classroom and how are they talking about things like, is talking about alcohol the really best thing to do to bond with your students? You know, seeing that, like, and we did it with the business argument instead of that you should do this because you're a nice human being. It's that when you talk about alcohol in your classroom, you're alienating students of color. And you say you want to retain students of color because our student of color retention rates are low, especially for African American men, it's at 33% if you're a 4-year student. And so that changes things. We saw a significant shift in thinking about health equity and allocation of resources. So like with most colleges, we do like choices, basics, K6, all of the normal things for the high-risk drinkers who get caught. And so we've been focusing on, we still have those things in place, but how do we shift resources to the secondhand impacts that these students are causing? And how are we supporting the students who are doing the things that we want them to do by not drinking and not participating? In what ways are we helping them create community? And so that's been shifting in allocation of resources and people thinking of ways to support students in other ways. There has been like a little bit backfire with that, is that like last fall when we had football, we had like 4 games in a row. And so the cultural centers just closed because they wanted students to be safe versus holding activities. And so that's just like one of the weird things. It elevated the voices of students of color or marginalized students on our campus, because again, their voices are not always heard unless it's to be specific. And then it has laid the groundwork for a lot of our intersectionality issues and conversations and practices on our campus. So it's not just an alcohol issue, it's alcohol tied to campus climate, tied to mental health, tied to sexual assault. And so we've been talking more whole-roundedly instead of just of alcohol is the thing you need to care about. Well, you need to care about alcohol because it impacts campus racial climate, it impacts mental health, and of course it impacts sexual assault. But so it's framed the way we talk about it, and even our administrators of there are more pieces. It's not just the alcohol and that our students are high risk drinking. And it's also shifted the narrative of how we talk about our drinkers, which is still hard for some people, with the exception of currently in COVID, of our drinkers are fine. Our majority drinkers are fine. So how are you helping those students who are not? If they do something bad, they will be caught. And there are processes for that. But our drinkers, our high risk drinkers are fine. Yes, health-wise, no. But like really shifting that narrative and trying to figure out how do you help, because students who don't drink, the students of color who don't drink have higher rates of mental health, have higher rates of victimization and all of that. So it's tying all of that together. and to answer some of the questions. Yeah, I mentioned that earlier, how we compare to the other university campuses in Wisconsin. We're still the highest of all with all of our alcohol surveys, and even like with our, we are at least a good 15% higher. And also the other schools tend to be smaller with the exception of Milwaukee. And so all of their bars are all in one location, which makes it a whole lot easier to do things and have relationships with the bars. In Madison, the state legislator cares about our data. We've talked to the ALRC, which is the Alcohol Licensing Review Committee, which run the municipality. Sorry, I can't find the words to say it. And we've shared this data and we've talked with them about some things, but depending on the place, because like there's been stings on one place in particular that is still open, like they can only do so much. We've had things written into people's agreements, but like again, holding it up and like making really the effort to change, because people are all about, well, because someone from the Tavern League sits on there too. It's like, we got to protect the businesses, and are you trying to hurt businesses becomes the bigger thing with the state legislature. We've had a couple of things go to the state legislature, but they don't make them that far. Or we've had odd things, like 2 years ago, they tried to get the drinking age to be lowered to 18 again. So that's some of the weird and wacky ways it works for us. So when we talk about drugs on our campus versus drinking, drugs are a whole lot lower. Comparatively, our second most largest drug happens to be marijuana, because it's not legal in our state. But then with some of the harder drugs like cocaine and heroin, there's like really low single digit use. But then if you look at certain populations, since we do have affluent students and Greek males like to use cocaine at 10% of the rate, but they can afford to get the drugs to get them. And we don't really have as many students because of the black box law in Wisconsin abusing like ADHD medication and all of that, because they only get a certain amount unless they're getting them from out of state where parents can send them. So if they use it or sell it or do anything else, they're not getting anymore. And they have to do it every 30 days. They don't give them just a blanket prescription. So we tend to see lower rates of drug usage, but compared to alcohol usage is by far and away our biggest thing. And we've seen an increase, minus this year, in e-cigs and just using marijuana and e-cigs overall with our campus community. So to summarize some things, alcohol use on our campus is correlated with, is correlated with academic and social success among our majority students. So alcohol is tied to whiteness. Students of color experience more negative consequences by not participating or participating a little bit, because there are some that participate, but it's to try and get those things like have social and friends. And high-risk drinking is how UW-Madison students connect. And allowances are made both academically and socially to participate in high-risk drinking. Are there any other questions? Because I know I'm at time.
If you have questions, let us know. I've got a question, Reonda.
Okay.
How about, you mentioned in one of your slides, how has university housing changed their policy? They made some changes to their policy, but how have they done that?
So housing is also part of our conduct board, but because they can do weirder things in weirder spots, because they have seen racism while drunk, they are more likely to move someone or terminate someone's contract like right away if that is the response. They're also doing restorative justice practices, which weren't there before, of like if someone has done harm, and especially a lot of the racist while drunk situations, and addressing it the first time, or it being seriously enough that students can get kicked out for one incident instead of, in the past, it took up to 5 before someone would be moved or kicked out for some of the racist while drunk things. And especially since there have been a lot of issues to the multicultural floor, and because of some of the swastika issues in the learning communities, they've had to be more responsive and have better policies to address students' drunken racist behavior and not let them get away with it. And in housing, that means kicking them out or moving them.
Thanks.
Oh, sorry. Scroll.
Another question. You said looks like there's some high achievers who drink, but do you know how does drinking impact graduation rates? It doesn't look like it's perhaps not impacting their GPA maybe, but does it in fact impact any of your graduation rates?
No, our white students still graduate on time. They get done in their 4 years. Sometimes they might stay on to 5, depending on if they're able to get their classes. But so their alcohol usage is not, and like depending on what resources or what veins they get into, there's like things that are set up to help them. I think we have a business school, for those of you that don't know, and business are the highest risk drinkers anywhere, second by engineering, which we have one of them schools too. And so like business teaches them that you do deals over drink, and they help perpetuate that and help them be able to succeed, and able to continue to be successful in their time at UW, because we are an academically rigorous institution. It's not that the drinking is helping them, but what drinking access gets you to resources and helps elevate and helps you be able to succeed your 4 years or longer, depending on what students choose, than other groups. Has the campus addressed racism and the actions of those who may have committed hate crimes? So, like I said, my campus does not do the greatest job about addressing racism, but we have, during this time of color of drinking, and because of 2016 more so than color of drinking, we've had to put a new process in place for dealing with like a reporting structure, and if we have all the information, they will deal with it. And like people have been kicked off, departments have been sat down and talked to because people be writing racist questions. And so there are ways, and like with police, sometimes that becomes the hard rock in the hard space, like with the girl that got spit on. They gave the person an alcohol ticket instead of an assault ticket, and like the person got into a fight with people on Twitter about the racism notes in it. But so it just depends on the thing. Our university does take this serious in that they want students to connect and belong and make sure that they're being upheld. But overall, dealing with racism, as I stated in the campus climate thing, my university is not good at. But yes, if they commit hate crimes, and depending on if we have all of the like video, because we have video everywhere, then that gets, hate crime is a federal charge. We haven't had, but I think 1 or 2, because we haven't had the proof to go after them. But if we do have the evidence, meaning cameras and things, then we do charge them as hate crimes. Like I said, the spitting incident, for example, didn't get charged as quite a hate crime. Some of the things from spring of 16 did get charged as hate crimes, and the Office of Civil Rights actually came to campus. So we have had some things that have gotten charged as hate crimes. They do have to take the alcohol EDU program, which is required. It's a drinking program before they come to campus. And I can track their data of what happens to them in the 6 weeks. So part 2 is open, and I'm like, so what have y'all been doing? Okay, question. Oh yes, I got kicked for holding this data with the second one, because we did go through IRB. So the first round of when we did this again, like people didn't have the best responses, or the administration more so. Students did, the MSC, like a lot of campus partners did, but like our administration did kick me a little bit, and I've got a couple of bruises from it. But then after they saw campus's response and people and students' response, because those are my best allies, they sort of have quieted down, and it's just like part of our campus culture. But like those first couple of months after the second one came out, because it's publishable, like I got responses from our chancellor: people can't know we're this bad. This shows us how bad. And it's like, it is what it is. But she did push back, or had advocates of hers push back a little bit. But now it's just so ingrained in campus climate. Again, those were rough 6 months, that people understand it. Well, thank you all for your time. I know I'm just over. If you want to contact me, it's here. And again, the booklet.
Well, thank you so much, Reonda. This was really insightful and helpful, and I love the information and data that you've collected and have shared. And I can see from the comments or the chat, a lot of others have found this really a great webinar as well. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and for Reonda Washington to share some of this information and insights from the University of Wisconsin.
Yes, thank you. Thanks a lot, Reonda. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
Like I said, we'll get this posted to the website and the slides out, but I hope you can join us for our next webinar. Not sure when, but thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.